Good morning, Moses Lake Christian Church. I'm coming to you today from the desert. I've come out early in the morning. It's cold, crisp morning into the desert to talk to you a little bit about the desert. You know, there were some people that we might think strange who lived in the early centuries of church history, and they were called the desert mothers and the desert fathers. And they were interesting in that they left their places of culture, their cities, their homes, their families, and they moved into places of seclusion in the desert. In part, they did it to get away from things, to lose and leave some things behind. But in other ways, they went there to find something. It's not uncommon that these desert mothers, desert fathers came from wealthy families that had maybe all the material resources that we could think, and they chose to leave that all behind and to either live in very small groups in the desert or to live completely solitary lives. An example of a desert mother is Sencledia of Alexandria. She lived in the 4th century, and she was from a very wealthy family. And she was said to be actually a woman of uncommon beauty. And when her family died, they left their estate to her, and she took all that they had and she sold it and gave all the money to the poor. And then she took her blind sister, and the two of them lived the life of a hermit. Mother Sencledia was asked, "Is absolute poverty perfect goodness?" And she replied, "It's a great good for those capable of it. Even those who are not capable of it find rest for their souls in it, though it causes them anxiety. As tough cloth is laundered pure white by stretched and trampled underfoot, so a tough soul is stretched by freely accepting poverty." One of the most famous desert fathers is Anthony the Great, which, by the way, I think is a really interesting, odd name for a holy hermit, Anthony the Great. But his story is similar to Sencledia's of Alexandria. He was born into a wealthy family. His parents were wealthy landowners, and after they died, he gave some of their property away to neighbors, and he sold the rest, and he gave all the money to the poor. And then he spent the next 15 years herding pigs. Then he went into the desert, and he lived an ascetic life, eating a very simple diet of bread and salt and water, no meat, no wine. Anthony was asked, "What must we do to please God?" And he answered this: "Keep what I tell you. Whoever you may be, always keep God before your eyes. And whatever you do, do it from the witness of the Holy Scriptures. And in whatever place you live, do not leave quickly. Keep these 3 things, and you will be saved." The desert's a strange place. It's often a place of struggling. It can be a place of struggling with our circumstances, a place of struggling with ourselves. At times, it's a place of struggling with the spiritual forces of evil. It can even be a place of struggling with God, but also a place where we find God. Anthony and Sencledia went into the desert because they heard God and they followed him, and they went there to find him. And as we come out of this season of Lent, we realize that the season of Lent commemorates Jesus' time in the desert. And we see that story in Luke chapter 4. You remember in verse 1, it says, "And Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days. You know, we all have times in the desert. Sometimes we're led there, sometimes we're driven there. At this time of isolation, in some ways, it feels like we've been driven into the desert. We didn't do this. We didn't choose this time of isolation. And it's not going to get over quickly. According to Governor Inslee's most recent mandate, it'll go through May 4th. And now I know we're not living in the desert like the desert fathers were precisely. Most of us are living in comfortable homes. We have food, we have water, we have some people around, we even have Netflix. But it's still not the same. It's a time of isolation, and our life has been disrupted and disoriented a little bit. Have you noticed the way that we change the way we interact with people? When I go to the grocery store, if I need to be there, I notice that people don't really look at each other or talk to each other. People stay far apart, which we're supposed to do. If you're going for a walk down the sidewalk, you notice people give each other a wide swath, don't talk much. It's changed our relationships. We're not physically present in our life groups. We're not taking our kids to soccer and piano and dance and baseball. School isn't providing the regular routine for us that it has. And so it's disrupted our schedule and our orientation in life. We aren't going into work. Last week I was on the phone with a lady from Verizon who lived in Alpharetta, Georgia, and I could hear kids in the background. And I said, "Hey, are you working from home?" She said, "We're all working from home. I'm really sorry about my kids." And I said, "Don't be sorry about your kids. Let them make noise. It feels a little bit like church. There's a lot of comfort in it." Things have changed. But our lives have been disrupted, and that causes disorientation. It can sometimes cause a fair amount of trouble when this happens in life. And one of the biggest things that happens in this microwave culture and when we go into the desert is that we ask the wrong questions. We probably spend too much time asking the question, how do I get out of here? Or maybe the question, when do I get out of here? And the question that I want to pose to us today is a different question. What do I get out of here? What can I get out of the desert? And so let's look at Luke chapter 4. It says that, "And Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. And he ate nothing during those days, and when they were ended, he was hungry. The devil said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread.' And Jesus answered him, 'It is written, man shall not live by bread alone.' And the devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time and said to him, 'To you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I will give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours.' And Jesus answered him, 'It is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve.' And he took him to Jerusalem and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest your foot strike against a stone.' And Jesus answered him, 'It is said, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test.'" Let's make some observations from this desert time. The first thing is we know the desert was a lonely, desolate place. The word here is eremos, and it means a place of emptiness or loneliness, literally a place of desolation. And we could feel like we're in a literal place of desolation right now. We find ourselves in the midst even of our normal lives at home and in our communities in a place of isolation. The loneliness of the stay-at-home order, the loss of hangouts, the loss of work, loss of fellowship, and it can lead us into a place of depression and darkness. It's a place of longing. Notice with Jesus, Luke makes the point of saying he didn't eat for 40 days and he was hungry. I think Luke makes this point because we sometimes have the tendency to put Jesus in this place where, he's not like us. But Luke says, no, he was there and he was hungry. He was longing for food, just like we would. The desert is a place of vulnerability at times. And Satan loves to attack us in our vulnerabilities. "Turn these stones to bread," he says to Jesus. "You can solve your hunger." Satan attacks Jesus' identity. 2 times he says, "If you are the Son of God." It's when we're tired that we're most vulnerable and questioning our own sense of value, our sense of worth. Vince Lombardi said, "Fatigue makes cowards of us all." We're at our most vulnerable when we're hungry and tired and thirsty and lonely and feeling abandoned. We have appetite for felt needs. We have appetite for divine intervention. We have appetite for people and relationships. It's a vulnerable place. But the desert needs to be named. It's important to recognize we actually are in a desert. Not to say, well, at least I don't have it as bad as someone else. You might not have it as bad as someone else, but where you are is where you are. And to pretend like it's not bad because it's not as bad as someone else is not a healthy place to be. We need to express our feelings of loneliness. We need to speak to God about those things, where we're feeling vulnerable, because it exposes our weakness, and God meets us in our weakness. And so we need to name our vulnerabilities. But we also need to remember that the desert is a place where we can find God. God goes with us into the desert. It's undeniable to know that God is with Jesus in the desert. It says that he was led by the Spirit into the desert. Mark puts it a different way in chapter 1, verse 12. It's more interesting. The Spirit drove him into the desert, but he went with him. We sometimes embrace this idea that if God is with us, everything is going well, everything is going to be perfect, it's all going to work in just the way we want. And even unconsciously, we think sometimes if we're in the desert, it must be because we've displeased God. But we know that wasn't the case with Jesus. The reality is that God goes with us in the desert, and we need to recognize it and embrace it. And one of the big dangers of the desert is trying to escape it prematurely or artificially. Satan gives Jesus the opportunity to get out of his predicament. Turn the stones to bread. You don't have to be hungry. Worship me and I'll give you everything that you want. Throw yourself down. Put God to the test. Make him prove that he really is your Father and your God. Think about the children of Israel in the wilderness. In Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 6, Moses goes up to the top of the mountain and God gives him the 10 Commandments. And while he's gone, the people of Israel cry out to Aaron and say, "We don't know where this Moses is. What are we going to do?" And Aaron says, "Give me all your gold." And so he puts it into the fire and he takes this gold and he fashions a golden calf with it. And then they worship the golden calf. We don't know where God is, so we're going to create God and we're going to worship him that way. In verses 15 through 24 of the same text, Moses comes down and he gets very angry and he says, "What in the world have you people done?" And Aaron says, "Hey, don't get mad at me. It's not my fault. The people wanted a God, and so we threw our gold into the fire and out danced this golden calf." What were we supposed to do? When we feel alone and vulnerable and in the desert, we sometimes want to get ourselves out. The solution for Aaron and the children of Israel in the desert wasn't to make their own God to worship, but it was to wait on the God who wanted to meet them in the desert. We need to remember that there's a purpose to the desert. It's not arbitrary. What's the purpose behind the desert for the people of God in this place? Well, take a look in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. God says, here's the reason for the desert. Whether it's 40 years or 40 days, here's the reason for it. God says, "I gave you the desert to humble you, to teach you, to show you my provision, and to discipline with the ultimate aim of blessing you." Go and read Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. The desert, God says it's a place of preparation. Think about all of the people that God took to the desert. Elijah, Moses, John the Baptist, Jesus, Paul, and a host of other people. You see, we don't see the desert as our end. We don't see our place of isolation as our end or as a place where God has left us. We should see it as a place where God faithfully will meet us. It's okay not to like the desert along the way. It can be hard for us for sure, and it may be a really hard time for you, maybe economically, maybe in terms of relationships and loneliness. But it can be a place where God meets us. And remember what Anthony the Great says, wherever you find yourself, don't leave that place quickly. Sometimes what is needed in the desert is a change of perspective. It's shifting our perspective. All you can see right now is me and sagebrush and desert. But that's not the only vision here. I want to show you something. It's almost like magic. Hang on. Isn't that cool? Sometimes we need a different perspective. Here's what's interesting. I actually moved less than 10 feet. I changed the camera angle just a little bit. And it's almost like we came from a desert into an oasis. Have you noticed a meme that's going around the internet lately? It says, you're not stuck at home, you're safe at home. Do you know what that's all about? It's literally just trying to help you change perspective. I recently watched a webinar by Dr. Henry Cloud about what happens in crisis. It's called The Psychology of Crisis, and it's really good. But he tells us a little bit about what happens to us. And one of the things that happens is that our mental map of the world is disoriented in crisis. We lose our regular connections and our structure and our support systems. And the structure of our lives gets thrown into upheaval. He talks about it like you know the layout of your house. And if somebody comes in and moves all the furniture and you're trying to get around in the dark, it can be really disorienting. And that's what crisis can be like. My life gets thrown off by crisis, I can tell you that. I can tell you my life gets thrown off by vacation. When the regular structures of my life are thrown off, it's really challenging for me, even though I create a bunch of the structure in my own life. We lose connections and it throws us into adrenal overload, he says, and that sends us into what we know of as fight, flight, or freeze. When things change and we get disoriented, we start to, all of our adrenaline goes into our brain and we use all of our brain power to try to get out of the situation that we're in. And we don't make good decisions in that place, and we don't learn in that place. We lose a sense of control. And he points out that people are control freaks. And I have to be honest, I've noticed that some of you really need to work on this. We are, aren't we? We like to control our environments. And when our environments gets out of our control, that really can cause us to lose focus. And then we go to a place of what he calls learned helplessness. We think there's nothing I can do. All is lost. I can't change anything. I might as well just lay down and quit. And we begin to unplug. And then we lose our sense of competency. We're not doing things in the same way. We're not doing things the way we're not feeling productive. We're not getting things done. We want to do something, and everything has changed. And maybe even if you're still at work, the way you're doing things has really changed. If you're a teacher going from teaching students in your classroom, now you're teaching students from home. Maybe you're building an online classroom. I can tell you that as a staff, we've been working very differently. It's become really challenging. You think making these videos is easy? It's awful. It's really hard. Give me 150 or 300 people to stand in front of. It's not disconcerting to me at all, but these videos are awful. A couple of weeks ago, I made one. It was 22 minutes long, and I got home and I started watching it, and there was a nose hair coming out. I thought, now I got to redo the whole thing because it was really, it's awful. We're not doing things the way we used to do. And so the reason that the desert is so challenging is that it's disorienting. And if we focus on the desert, we lose hope. We can become depressed. We can sink into darkness. And so what do we do with it? And some of this, again, comes from Dr. Henry Cloud. First thing is we have to reorient ourselves to this new reality that we're living in. We know it's not going to last forever, but it is going to last for a little bit of time. It's going to be more than 40 days. And so even if you're working from home and your life has been a little disrupted, you need to build and reorient your life to this new way of doing things for a little while longer. Because God wants to use this moment to shape us. And just as the Spirit went into the wilderness with Jesus, God's in the wilderness with us. He doesn't want us to wait till we get out of this place to learn, to grow, and to change. He wants us to use this place to learn and to grow. And so we don't have to get out of the desert to find streams of living water. Sometimes we can find them right there, but we have to reorient our lives to this new place. And then we need to build structures that work for us in this new reality. If you're in a household where your kids are home now and you're working from home, you're going to be busier there. And so you need to create some structures and some space where you can breathe and find God. I don't know what that is for you, but you're going to have to find those. If you're really lonely, you're going to have to build some structure for connecting with people and meeting with people. Some structures for meeting with God. Trevor Hudson has a wonderful book called Loneliness, the Gift of God's Friendship. Sometimes getting alone helps us and pushes us to find God even more than ever. If we're living with fear and insecurity, we need to name those things. Henry Cloud says, make a list, 2 columns. One, things you can't control, and on the other column, things you can control. And he said, then take some time and really worry about the things you can't control. Yeah, that's right. Really worry about the things you can't control. Take 5 or 10 minutes. But he says, then let those things go because you can't do anything about them. But then focus your attention on the things you can control. Make a list of those and start taking steps, even little steps, to do those things. And then see the bigger narrative. The desert isn't the end of the story. And even when it feels like it is, and it's really isolated and we're alone and we can't be with others, we need to make use of this time. It's not going to last forever. What things does God want to teach us right now in the desert? And so we remember the words of Sancletia of Alexandria. Let's not let this time go to the waste. This is a time in which the cloth of our lives is being stretched a little bit. Let's let it shape us. Let's remember the words of Anthony the Great. Always keep God before your eyes. What are the structures of worship that you're putting in place so that you can keep your eyes on God and not on the desert? He says, do it from the witness of the Holy Scriptures. What are the structures? What's the trellis that you've put in place for your devotional life at this time? It's probably been disrupted, so create a new one. Make it work for the situation that you're in right now. And then he says, and in whatever place you find yourself, don't leave quickly. How can you find ways to, as hard as it might be right now, rest in the goodness of God, even in the desert experience? Where can you find living water? Because the desert's not the end of the story. In Luke chapter 4, verses 13 through 15, it says, and when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. And Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and a report about him went through all the surrounding country, and he taught in the synagogues, being glorified by all. The desert was a time of preparation that really built and shaped Jesus, and he went out of it in the power of the Spirit. The hope in the desert is to find God there, to grow through that time, and grow in the power of the Spirit. The desert can be a profoundly difficult place if we focus on the desert, but it can also be a place where we find rivers of living water. We can find God there, and we can allow him to shape us there. And so, here's some questions. What are you hearing from God in this moment? What's he teaching you? And then what are the structures that you can put in place to help you to live through this time in a healthy and thriving way? What are the things you can't control, and what are the things you can control? Worry about those things you can't control, then set them aside and focus on what you can control. And then how can you worship and connect and serve in the desert? It's going to look different, but what are the ways that you can engage in authentic, life-giving relationships now, right where you are? I want to leave you with this blessing. May God give your body strength and health and give you protection against this virus that's moving over our earth. May God give you meaningful work and the resources that your family needs for your daily life. May God pour his love and life into your heart so that you may experience his peace and joy and hope day by day. May God preserve your relationships and even cause them to flourish, whether you're separated, whether you're with family, spending time together. May God give your marriage sweetness, your family closeness, and your friendships a deep richness. And may you find God in this place, wherever you are, and seek to stay put with him there. May your faith grow, and your trust expand, and you experience God and his peace beyond measure. The peace of God be with you.